So we're now on the top of Daf Tzadi Hey Amid Beis, and we're up to the third line. The Mishnah tells us, "Harishon ton halel bachiloso, v'asheni eno ton." And here's the distinction between the first Pesach and the second Pesach with regard to the mitzvah of Hallel, the recitation of Hallel, with regard to the Achila, when we eat the Pesach, whether it's the Pesach that we eat on Tesvav B'Nisan, the Pesach that we eat on Yudalid, the Iyar. The question is, do we recite Hallel? Now, this seems to be a strange requirement, Hallel. And especially in the case of Pesach Sheni, and there's no Yontif per se, but even in the case of Pesach Rishon, the Hallel of Yontif is going to be recited the next morning on Tesvav by day. Why are we reciting Hallel at night? Minani Mili. Is there a source somewhere for this assumption that on Pesach Rishon, at the time of the Achilas HaPesach, we have to recite Hallel? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum, Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadok. Amar Kro, we have a pasuk in Yeshayahu Navi, in Perek Lamed of Yeshayahu Navi. It says, Hashir Yelachem Kelel Hiskadesh Cha. The shir that you sing by day, which is a song of praise for the Geula, for the redemption from Golus. And now what Yeshayahu Navi is prophesizing is the vision of the end of days. At that time, during the day, we will sing the praise of Hashem for bringing about the Geula from Golus, the ultimate redemption. That same shir, Yeshayahu says, applies as noeg balayla shemiskadish chag. Aleph. In other words, that although we have a mitzvah of shira that applies during the day, and that's classic Hallel to thank Hashem for the Geula, Yeshayahu is obligating us in a shira of Leil HaChag, Kalel Hiskadish Chag. And here too, there's a chiv shira. So in addition to the shira that we recite by day, which is the classic Hallel to thank Hashem, there's also, in addition, a mitzvah of Hallel on the night of Pesach, and the assumption is that that mitzvah of Hallel at night has something to do with simcha, with some joy, and it's the joy of eating the Korban Pesach. So that's all derived from Kelel Hiskadesh Chag. And Leil HaMakudesh L'Chag Ton Hallel, Laila Sheini Makudesh L'Chag Eino Ton Hallel. In other words, we're now excluding Pesach Sheni because the night of Pesach Sheni is not a yontif at all. So what we basically need is a Leil Hiskadesh Chag. It's not the Hallel of yontif; it's the special Hallel that's engendered by the Achilas HaPesach as a unique mitzvah. And that only applies when you have these two elements together. You have A plus B. You've got a Leil Hiskadesh Chag, a night that has the sanctity of Kedushas Chag, plus you have the simcha of this brand new mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach. But in the case of Pesach Sheni, you may have that simcha of Achilas HaPesach, but you don't have a Leil Hiskadesh Chag. It's lacking the Kedushas Chag. So I'll just read to you a note I have here in the Masechet. He writes, Hashir shetashiru biyom shetigolu min hagolus, yeh also shir shetem noagim lashir balayla shemiskadish chag, which means Hallel. V'ein leil chag sheshayich bo chiyuv shira milvad leil haPesach. The only night that generates a chiyuv shira is the night of Pesach, when we eat the Korban Pesach. The Mishnah continues, even Pesach Sheni requires a recitation of Hallel at the time of the Hakrava, meaning the Shechita. My time, what is the source for a chiyuv, even in Pesach Sheni, to recite Hal at the time of the Shchitas HaKarban? And here the Gemara offers two sources. Ibais Ema, one source is Laila Kamimait, but Yom Lo Kamimait. We go back to the same pasuk in Yeshaya that we studied, Kelel Hiskadish Chad, and that we said was the exclusion of the night of Pesach Sheni. But the exclusion is only with regard to the Laila, because it says Kelel Hiskadish Chad, excluding the Laila of Pesach Sheni, which is the time when we eat the Pesach. But as far as the Zman Shchita is concerned, which is B'yom, there's no miyut in the pasuk, and therefore we assume that Pesach Sheni, as far as Halel Bi Asiyoso, meaning at the time of Shchita, is equal to that of Pesach Rishon. It requires Halel B'Shas Shchita. Ibay Sema, Efshar Yisrael Sholtin es Tischayim V'Notlin es L'Levim V'Eino B'Halel. The Gemara now offers the possibility that we don't need a pasuk, we don't need a source to derive the conclusion that Pesach Sheni needs Halel B'Asiyoso, because whenever you have an Asiyas HaMitzvah, like Bnei Yisrael are shechting their Pesach, which again in the case of Pesach Sheni is a limited group, but it's nevertheless a group, or when Klal Yisrael take the lulav, and Nodlin es L'Leveim is a language which the Gemara here borrows from a brisa that we'll get to later at the end of the Masechet. Is V'Eino Mim Shira? Could it possibly Eino Mahalik possibly that we don't? It's pashut then that at the time of the mitzvah we require Halel. A mitzvah that's done, that's performed on a Chag requires Halel. And the Ikar HaSimcha is of course the mitzvah's Hachag, the mitzvah that we have to fulfill on the Chag. That's when we recite Hallel. Then the Mishnah says Necholim Tzli, that Pesach Sheni, like Pesach Rishon, has to be eaten roasted, and it's Doches HaShabbos. So the Gemara is Medayik. Shabbos in, Tuma lo. If, let's say, the person who was pushed off to Pesach Sheni is Tameh on the 14th of Iyar, he will not bring the carbon. This is the Tanakam. And the only equation now to be docha for the sake of the carbon is as far as Shabbos. So Pesach Sheni overrides Shabbos like Pesach Rishon, but a Tameh will not bring Pesach Sheni. Masnisin Delok Rabbi Yehuda. Now we're going to learn a brisa which begins with the Tanakama that reflects what we just learned in our Mishnah, but will contradict Rabbi Yehuda, who's quoted in the Sefer of this brisa. The brisa opens Doches HaShabbos v'eina Doches HaTumah, but Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he disagrees, Af Docha Es HaTumah. And the Gemara now is going to analyze this machlokes as to whether or not a Tameh can bring Pesach Sheni. My time of the Tanakama. And the logic is very compelling. Why didn't he bring Pesach Rishon? You rejected him from Pesach Rishon because he was Tameh, and Yachsav Yasenu B'Tumah, and now he's going to do a Pesach Sheni B'Tumah. Rabbi Yehuda says the following: the Torah pushed off the Tameh from Pesach Rishon. Chazar Olav Las also B'Tara. The Torah says, let's try to find a possibility, if it's all possible, to bring a B'Tara. I'll give you Pesach Sheni. But Lo Zocha, if it didn't work out that he could be Torah Pesach Sheni, Yaseh B'Tumah. At least let him bring Pesach Sheni. He has no choice but to bring a B'Tumah. Let's be compassionate. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Brisa, Pesach Rishon Doches HaShabbos. Pesach Sheni Doches HaShabbos. Okay, that's something that's universally accepted. However, Pesach Rishon Doches HaTumah, that's universally accepted. But Pesach Sheni Doches HaTumah, that's only according to Rabbi Yehuda. So this brisa would have to be authored by Rabbi Yehuda. But then the brisa concludes with something that cannot be accepted by Rabbi Yehuda. Pesach Rishon Ton Lina and Pesach Sheni Ton Lina. The brisa equates Sheni to Rishon not only with regard to Shabbos and Tumah, but even with regard to the mitzvah of Lina that you have to sleep over in Yerushalayim that night, the night following the Karban. And we'll see soon that Rabbi Yehuda rejects this. So let's analyze the Brisa. Who is the author of the Brisa? Doches hatuma kiman Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim say that Pesach Sheni is not dochet tuma. But for Rabbi Yehuda told Lina, how could the Brisa in the same breath be Rabbi Yehuda saying that you need Lina? Tanya Rabbi Brisa Rabbi Yehuda Minayin lePesach Sheni she'ein ton Lina she'nemar ufanisa baboker ve'alachta li'olecha. With regard to Pesach Rishon, the Torah says that the night of Pesach Rishon, meaning the night of Tesvav B'Nisan, you should sleep over in Yerushalayim, and then in the morning, you turn around and you go back home if you live outside Yerushalayim. Uksiv. So that's the mitzvah of Lina, the Chi of Lina. But immediately after that pasuk, it says, Sheishes Yomim Tochal Matzos. The mitzvah of matzah. So what do we derive from this smichus? Asks Rabbi Yehuda. That dafka b'Pesach hanechal l'shisha, with regard to the mitzvah of Pesach Rishon, where you have another 6 days of Pesach coming along, where there's a mitzvah of eating matzah and to the exclusion of eating chametz, ton lina. The Torah went out of its way to describe and limit the mitzvah of Lina to that which is applicable to Shisha Yomim, namely Pesach Rishon. But when you get to Pesach Sheni, we don't eat matzah for 6 days, is Ein Ton Lina. So Gemara answers, Trei Tanoia, Liba de Rabbi Yehuda. We have two traditions of two different brisos as to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Does Pesach Sheni have a mitzvah of Lina like Pesach Rishon? And on this we have a contradiction in Brises because there are two different traditions as to what Rabbi Yehuda's opinion was on that question. And now we start the next Mishnah here on Daf Tzadi Hey Amid Beis. The Torah says with regard to Korban Pesach Sheni, each kiyet tamei lenefesh v'asa Pesach Lashem. And the Gemara had already derived from the word each that if he was tamei, as an individual, each meaning one person, singular, then we push him off to Pesach Sheni. But the tzibur, if Rov tzibur are tmeim, then we will bring Pesach Rishon b'tumah. And we don't push it off to Pesach Sheni. Now, furthermore, we have to keep in mind that the Gemara Daf Samach Zayin had a drasha with regard to this pasuk, and it's referring to Tumas Mes. So it means Rov tzibur were contaminated with Tumas Mes. Like, let's say the Nasi died and they all went out to be Mitame. And then we do the Korban Pesach B'tumah. However, that's only Tumas Mes. Because it says, Ki Tomei Yetame L'Nefesh. But what about other Tumas? Ziva, for example. Those are pushed off to Pesach Sheni, and it wouldn't make any difference even if Rov Tzibur were Tmeim B'Tumas Ziva. The same law would apply. We'd have to push this off to Pesach Sheni. So the Mishnah now clarifies some of the dinim of Tumah in the cases where he does not contract Tumas Mes. A Pesach Sheba B'Tumah, Rov Tzibur Tmeim Mesim, as we said before, then Lo Yochlu Mimenu Zavim, etc. Other Tmeim cannot eat from the Korban Pesach. The Torah only allowed the Tamei Mes to eat from the Korban Pesach. For example, Zavim, Zavos, Nidos, Violdos, all those, Shar Tmeim, will not eat from the Korban Pesach. However, you might say that somebody who's Tamei and doesn't have a right to eat from Kodshim, he incurs a Chi of Kares. Pturim, if they went in and they ate from Kodshim, Bituma, in this case, and they had no right to do so, they are parted from Kares. The Gemara is going to derive this from Drashos. Now, what would happen if the Zav, Zava, your lettuce, etc., went into the Azara? That's another Chi of Kares for a Tamei for Bias Migdash Bituma. that would apply to a zav and a zav. What are you doing in the Azara? You have no right to go into the Azara. And Rabbi Eliezer goes a step further. He says, to the same extent that you potted up the zav for eating from the Korban Pesach under the chiyuv kares of Tomei sha'ochal es hakodshim, we're going to exempt him from kares in the case of bias migdash. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the price Zavin, v'zavos, nidos, v'yoldos, sha'ochlu b'pesach sheba b'tumah. What happens if any of the above were not permitted to eat from the Korban Pesach, even though the Tmei Mesim are eating carte blanche, all of them, from the Korban Pesach, is Yochal Shiyu Chayav, and maybe they should be Chayav Kares, because our Ochal Kodshim B'tum is Chayav Kares. The Tmei Mes was allowed to eat in this case by virtue of the Gzeres HaKosuv, but these Shar Tmeim were not allowed, so they should therefore incur Chayav Kares. Talmud Lomar, we go back to the source for the Iser of Achilas Kodshim B'tumah, which is in Vayikra Perek Zayin. And it says, Kol Tahor Yochal Basar, V'hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlom ashel Hashem v'tumas olav v'nichvasa. So look at the juxtaposition between the Reisha and the Sefer. The Reisha tells us that a tar should eat from the basar kodshim. And the Sefer tells us that if a tamei eats from the basar kodshim, then he's chayav kares. What's the connection between the two? And the answer is that if the basar lends itself to be eaten by tahorim, and only by tahorim, which is the ratio of the basar, al tar yochal kodesh, then there's a chiyuv kares for a tamei to eat the basar kodesh. So nechal tahorim, if the basar is eaten by tahorim, then we go to the seif of the pasuk, Chayav Allah mishum tamei sha'achal kodesh she'eno nechal torim. But like for example, the case of Pesach Haba B'tumah, which is eaten by Tmei Mason, is ein Tmeim Chayav Allah mishum tamei. Again, just as a mnemonic device, I don't know if this is the real lumdus of it, but certainly it'll help me remember it. What we're saying is that when a tamei eats this basar, and the basar is kodesh, it's because he's in a sense desecrating the kedusha of the basar. It's aloch in the cheft of the basar. We have to protect the kedusha of the basar. We cannot allow a tamei to eat that basar, and it's a severe iser kares. But if the basar already is on the lower level and tmeim already eating from it, so that this basar in its level of kedusha is not antithetical to achilas hatamei, then even a tamei like a zav who's not allowed to eat from this basar, he's not doing the same chilul vis-a-vis the basar, because the basar is on a quote unquote a lower level insofar as it's mutter for tmei mason. Now we get to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer took this all one step further, and he's going to apply this principle of being mekil and removing these sakares to the case of bias migdash. Yochel dachaku zavin v'nichnasu lazar v'pesach haba b'tumah. Now I'm not exactly sure why the zavin and the mitzorayim push themselves into the azara. I mean, they're not part of the Pesach, and they can't eat from the Pesach. But that was the reality. They went in. Maybe they were very curious, or maybe they weren't aware of the fact that they were zavim. And they went into the Azara, but Pesach Haba B'tumah, in a case where Rov HaTzibur were Tmei Mason. Yochel, I might think you Chayav Kares, because Baal HaMikdash B'tumah is Chayav Kares once he enters into the Azara, and that's indeed the sheet of the Chachamim. And Rabbi Eliezer raises this as a Hamamina, Talmud Lomar, but the Maskana is the Yeshalchu Min HaMachne Kol Tarua V'Chol Zav V'Chol Tamei Nefesh. This is a pasuk in the beginning of Bamidbar, in Perkei Bamidbar, and it formulates the mitzvah of Shiluach Min HaMachna, that a tzarua or a zav has to leave the machna. In the case of the zav, he has to leave 2 machnos. In the case of a mitzori, he has to be thrown out of 3 machnos, chutz to 3 machnos. But anyway, what do you see? We're talking about a situation in which the machne doesn't tolerate the presence of tmeim. So bisman shetmei mesim mishtalchim, if all tmeim, in other words, the azara is completely repulsed, so to speak, by any form of tumah. And a tummy messes, if he goes into the azara, he'll be chayiv kares. So the azara is like in a pure, ultimate state. Is then zovin mitzar mishtalchim, and if they go in, they'll be chayiv kares. However, what about the situation of Pesach haba b'tumah, where the azara now all of a sudden becomes very tolerant, very liberal, and allows tmeim to enter into the azara? And tmei mesim ishtalchim. So now the azara is, so to speak, on a lower level. If you follow my model from before, in the case of the basar, that the basar, although it's kodesh, it's allowed to be eaten by tmeim because of Pesach haba b'tumah, and therefore the zav and zava will not be chayv kares. Here too, the azara allows the entry of tmeim, and therefore zav and zava, if they enter in, even though they're not allowed to do so, they will not be chayv kares. Is ein zavin mitzorah and mishtal. Why Rav Yosef? By the way, this next Gemara of Yosef is a real lumdish Gemara. I wish I had time to really study this. Be'ir. Dachaku tmei mesim v'nichnesu lehechal v'pesach haba b'tumah mal. We have now a case of Pesach haba b'tumah, and the tmei mesim are allowed to enter into the azar, but they push themselves beyond the azar into the hechal. The Heichal has a higher level of Kedusha than the Azara. And surely they weren't allowed to enter into the Heichal. So the original Isser of Bias Migdash, which is a Chiyuv Karetz, if you're tummy and you go into the Migdash, although it doesn't apply in a Pesach haba b'tumah vis-a-vis the Azara, but what would happen vis-a-vis the Heichal? Mao. Is there a Chiyuv Karetz in such a case? For Bias Migdash b'tumah, if the tummy mess enters into the Heichal. And here the two tzadim in the Suffolk of Rav Yosef. Mi de Ishrei Tuma de Tumas Azara, Ishrei Nami Tumas Heichal. Do we view the Heichal as an extension of the Azara? And if the Torah allows Bias Azara, then it will allow ipso facto Bias Heichal. The Migdash is one entity. Once the Torah would give license to the Tmeim in the case of Pesach haba b'tumah to enter into the Azar, there's no Isur Bias Mikdash. Then if they went into the Heichal, so they upped it by one, but it's all within the confines of the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore there's no Chiyuv Karetz. Oh, Dilma, shall we say, my the Ishtri, my the low Ishtri. The Torah permitted entering into the lower level of Kedusha. Again, when I say lower, it's a very high level, but relative to the Heichal, it's low. And the Torah allowed the Tmei Mason to enter into the Azar, but the Torah never went ahead and allowed the Tmei Mason to enter into the Heichal, and if they did so, they incur Chiyuv Karetz. So that was the suffix of Rav Yosef. And it would seem now from the next Gemara of Rava that Rava also vacillated about the same thing. But it's not really exactly precisely true to formulate it that way. There were two traditions and transmissions of Rava's opinion on this question. And whether Rava himself vacillated between the two opinions, I don't know. That I can't tell you. But let's go through the Lishna Kama and then the Lishna Basra. Amar Rava, there is a Chiyuv Karetz. I can identify with this first Lishna. It seems to me that for a Tommy to enter into the Heichal when he has no right to do so, certainly should be an Isser Chomer. But where do we derive this from? Amar Kra. The Torah says, and we saw this is in Bamidbar Perkei, remember, Vishalchu min hamach, which means miktas mach, is afilu miktas mach. In other words, this word min is coming to teach me, says Rava, that if the Tmei Mesim are not sent from the entire Mach, like for example in Pesach haba b'tumah, but they are still sent from and excluded from Mikdas Mach. So therefore Tommy Mes is allowed to enter into the Azara. That's the Mikdas Mach that the Torah permitted. But if he enters into the Heichal, then he's Chayiv Karetz. And there is a Shiluach of miktas machne. So the word mina machne in the parsha shiluach machne is coming to include the case of Pesach Haba B'Tumah as far as miktas machne, min hamachne, and that means the heicha. Ika diamri. Now we have a different lishna. The second lishna is going to maintain that according to Rav, we're going to be makil, and we're going to assume that there's no chi of kares if the tummy mess in the case of Pesach Haba B'Tumah is into the heichal. Omar Rav Hamakra. The Yishalchu min hamachne, and then immediately afterwards, it says El michutz lamachne tishalchum, and we have now a smichus, a juxtaposition of two psukim, and that's going to give us the following principle: Kol heicha de karinen bay. When we can apply the principle of El chutz lamachne tishalchum, that we have to send them out of Kol machne, the entire machne, then karinen bay. Then we apply the principle of Yishalchu min hamachne, that we have to send them out of the Heicha. But in the case of Pesach Haba B'Tumah, where there's no Shiluach from the Azara, we don't have to send them out of the Heicha, meaning there's no Chiyuv Karetz. Boy, Rav Yosef Dachaku Tnei Mason V'Ochlu Emurei Pesach Haba B'Tumah. What happens if a Tmei Mes, in the case of Pesach Haba B'Tumah, ate from the Emurim, which are the Evarim that require Hakrova Ktova al Gabi Mizbech, like Kloyos V'Yoseres HaKoved. And here we turn to Daf Tzadi Vav. Ma'u, what's the din? Are they chayav kares for Achilas Kodshim B'Tumah? Or maybe we'll say that they're part of a kares. What are the two tzaddim? Mida Ishtri Tumas Basar is Ishtri Nami Tumas Emurim. Once the Torah allowed the Tmeim to eat from the basar of the Pesach, even though they're Tmeim, now the Torah is going to allow them to eat from the Emurim B'Tumah. Meaning, of course, they cannot eat from the Emurim B'Tumah, but they would not incur Chiv Kares for Tumah. Oh, Dilma, should we say, my history, my low history? The Torah allowed them to eat the Tumas, the basar B'Tumah, but not the Emurim B'Tumah. And therefore, they should be Chiv Kares for eating the Emurim B'Tumah. Amar Rava. Now here we have only one lishna, and michti tumas emurim mehecha yisrabe. What's the source for the chiv karis if you eat the emurim b'tumah? Is mitumas basar. We find that there's an equation between the emurim b'tumah and the basar b'tumah. With regard to the iser of achilas basar kodesh b'tumah, it says the chsiv vayikra zayin. And I'll read the whole pasuk on nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomet shel Hashem v'tumaso olav v'nichrasai nefesh ahi me'ameh. And it says here shlomim asher l'Hashem. That's redundant. The pasuk would be fine and complete even without those two words asher l'Hashem. And the answer is lerabos es ha'imurim. The extra words asher l'Hashem is referring to include the basar that's that we makir for Hashem on the Mizbeach, and he's chayav kares. And since this is the source for the din of being metame of a tame who ate basar kodesh, we're going to equate the din of kol hecha the isa letumas basar. In any case where there's an isa the tame to eat the basar isa letumas emurim, then and only then is there a chiyuv for eating tuma. Eating the emur b'tumah, but b'chol heicha the lesser l'tumas basar, the basar itself doesn't lend itself to an iser of achilus basar b'tumah. Like for example, Pesach Haba b'Tumah is leise l'tumas emurim. There's no iser to eat the emurim b'tumah, which really means that there's no chiyuv kares. And then this is where we're going to stop. Here we're up to Boy Rab Zera.